Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Jillian York and I'm EFF's Director for International Freedom of Expression. I'm really excited to present our second At Home with EFF event. And before we get started, I'm just gonna do a couple small housekeeping items. First off, we will have live captioning for this event, and we'd like to thank White Coat Captioning for that. You can see the link and view the captions there. And if you like what you see today, please donate to our work at eff.org/EFF at home. So thanks for joining us for what I hope is going to be a really lively conversation about content moderation. Today, we're going to focus particularly on the question of what's happening right now, particularly after content moderators have largely gone home. Although we'll also pan out a bit to look at the broader issues at hand and touch on some specific communities that are particularly affected. I'm joined today by EFF's legal director, Corinne McSherry, as well as Masa Alimadani, who is a freedom of expression researcher at Article 19 and also working on her PhD at Oxford Internet Institute. And finally, with Jeff Deutsch, who's the lead researcher at Syrian Archive and has just finished his PhD at the Humboldt University in Berlin. So we'll start in just a minute, but stay tuned after this discussion because we're going to have a very special musical guest straight from Berlin. And a second EFF panel on privacy, security, and new technologies to fight the pandemic. So everybody got their cameras on and ready?
Hi there.
Awesome. So here are all of our panelists. Excellent. So without any further ado, let's get started. Corinne, I'm going to start with a question for you. As EFF's legal director, what concerns you the most right now, right in this moment that we're in, when it comes to free speech online, and particularly when it comes to free speech on corporate platforms?
Sure. So I'm very worried about a combination of things that I think are going to be dangerous for speech. One thing is that the reality is that with the content moderators going home, often in many cases not able to work from home, what that means is we're going to see, and we already are seeing, all of the decisions around content moderation going to robots. And we know from decades of experience now that unfortunately, automated tools are not very good at distinguishing between lawful and unlawful speech, between appropriate and inappropriate speech, according to the company's own policies. They're just not very good at it. And so that means that a lot of lawful and even important speech is going to be taken down. Speech about health and education and so on is going to be misidentified as a violation. And that's combined with, I think, a great deal of pressure on a lot of the major platforms to make policy decisions quickly, to turn on a dime, to revisit their policies, to address obviously a very important public health concern. But unfortunately, history tells us that they're not going to do it very well. And so what that tells me is two things. One is we need a lot of transparency. We need massive transparency, much more than we currently have around those decisions, around those tools, around those policies. And then the second thing that we need it now, and we're going to need it later too, when we have to go back and revisit what's happening, when we're perhaps a little less hurried. The other thing that we need is redress. We need appeal. When you know mistakes are going to be made, you have to have a process by which those mistakes can get fixed and can get fixed quickly. So those are sort of a big part of EFF's agenda right now. And one of the things I would point listeners to or viewers to is a project we have going called the Santa Clara Principles. And we're actually, and those are a set of principles that call on platforms, we call on platforms to commit to these principles, and they include rules around redress and rules around transparency. And we have a public consultation going right now because we want public input on the ideas in those principles as we sort of do a sort of 2.0 version. So I think Jillian, or at some point we can share in the chat a link to that consultation. And we have to be thinking about what's happening now, but we also have to think ahead a little bit to what we're going to need to do to protect speech going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely agree, of course. But I'm just moderating today. So Masa, let me turn to you and ask you a question. So at Article 19, you guys are a really big global organization. What sort of changes have you and colleagues witnessed when it comes to content moderation since the beginning of the pandemic, but really since the beginning of kind of the lockdown measures and the pulling back of human content moderation?
So, I mean, just like Corinne alluded to, it's a kind of unprecedented state where there needs to be a lot of interventions in terms of content moderation to make sure, there's a process for removing misinformation, disinformation that could potentially be very harmful to people's lives and to public health in general. So it's kind of, I know my colleagues are really involved in the Santa Clara principles, but it's a time of worry because again, there isn't a very strong precedent for content moderation to occur with a lot of transparency, to occur with a lot of diligent due process. And so there is a fear that the processes that are in place right now to remove content might have repercussions beyond this pandemic, and when we move out into a time when public health isn't the major issue. So that's one of the major concerns of what this will mean for broader content moderation after the pandemic.
Absolutely. And I want to come back later to what we're hoping to see after the pandemic. But let me ask you just a quick follow-up on that. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're seeing right now? And I think really outside of the US, because I know we've got a lot of folks in the US who can actively see what's happening there. But what are you seeing in terms of misinformation or content takedowns?
So I focus personally on Persian content and content that's being presented in the Middle Eastern region, and it's content that's not in the English language. And so in generally speaking, when it comes to content moderation, this has been kind of a struggle to make sure that different dialects, different languages have the appropriate cultural background and knowledge to be able to process through what's being put there. So for example, one of the biggest platforms in Iran is Instagram, and how Iranians use Instagram, they use captions a lot. There's a lot of content that goes into those captions. It doesn't necessarily go through the regular processes that Facebook puts into place to monitor that particular platform. So that's one of the struggles. Just last weekend, actually, one of my colleagues was dealing with an issue of content takedown on Instagram in Morocco, and finding content moderators that not only knew Arabic, but knew the Moroccan dialect specifically to address some of those issues. It was the issue of an individual who had put a call to go kind of target gay men in Morocco on LGBTQ dating platforms. And so getting those posts removed that was kind of instigating this violence against gay men in this, Morocco better than me, and finding the content moderators to be able to, take down those posts was quite difficult and quite a challenge, given the context. It was happening in the middle of the pandemic when, they're already overwhelmed with the situation at large.
Yeah, it seems like there's a definite imbalance there in terms of languages, and that's something that we're hoping to to bring more into the public conversation through consultations and through conversations like this. Jeff, let me turn to you a little bit because I want to hear your thoughts on automation. I know Syrian Archive has, I don't know if folks watching are familiar with their work. You should definitely check it out. They've been concerned for a long time about the broad use of automation. We wrote a paper together last year specifically looking at the way that human rights content, documentation of war crimes, things like that, often comes up on corporate platforms and can be taken down. So tell us a little bit more about your work and how the current situation is affecting it.
Sure. And if I cut out at any time, maybe cut the video for a better connection, but I'll try to speak slowly. So what we do at Syrian Archive is we collect, preserve, process, verify, and try to add value to mostly what we call user-generated content, right? So this is content that's posted largely to social media platforms, platforms like YouTube, like Twitter, like Facebook, like Instagram, right? Like many of the things that Maha was just talking about. And we've been working for about 6 years now, and on a variety of platforms we've collected and in the case of Syria, about 3.5 million posts, right, or records, right? Roughly 1.5 million videos from YouTube, and the remaining mostly from Facebook and Twitter, right? And one of the reasons that we started was because we were seeing in 2013, 2014, a lot of the content that was documenting these human rights abuses that was uploaded to some of these social media platforms was being removed. Then mostly in coordinated flagging campaigns. But we saw that this changed, right? So in 2017, platforms started to use automated or machine learning technology to kind of detect and remove content that they deemed as extremist, right? Largely under pressure from Western governments, right? European and the US in particular. So then in 2017, overnight, we saw like millions of posts being removed, right? And at the time, we at Syrian Archive were putting together a report on attacks on hospitals and medical facilities. And we saw that overnight, all of these videos that we had included in our reports were not available anymore, right? So we were able to work with platforms and try to get some of this content reinstated. Platforms have actually improved their content moderation policies and procedures and started to use human reviewers to a much larger extent. Can you hear me? I think the connection is cutting.
I can hear you. I don't know if folks listening live.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, so we saw that platforms were starting to use humans, you know, and human content moderators to a larger extent, and this was improving the accuracy of some of the they were using, right? And as a result, we saw that things generally, you know, seem to improve to a certain extent, right? We don't know, of course, what or how much content has been removed prior to being, you know, this content being made public, right? But we do know that the content that we have archived, we've seen a percentage of this kind of being reduced in terms of things being, you know, taken down over and over and over, right? So what's concerning with COVID-19 is, like all of us, the human reviewers are home. Right, so platforms have sent these human reviewers home. They subcontract these in many cases to separate companies, right? And these companies have their employees at home who aren't reviewing this content right now, right? Either because of privacy policies, right? Based on the platforms or based on the country, right? But also because a lot of this material is quite traumatic, right? And it's not something that you would want people to be watching, you know, at their homes, right? So this is also, you know, good for the human reviewers, right? Something that we're concerned with is this might be a return to what we saw in 2017, right? And we don't know for certain yet. We're still doing analysis on the amount of content that's been taken down, but already on YouTube, we've analyzed about 70% of the videos that we've archived to see if those are available or not. And we've already seen that there's an additional 50,000 videos that have been removed, right? So we're seeing that this trend is increasing. And we don't know to what extent the remaining 30% is going to see. So in about a week, we're going to be presenting a new report that's going to be showing figures for Twitter and for YouTube. And this will, I guess, give a good overview of to what extent having human reviewers, right, makes a difference with you know, this content moderation policies, right? Does that kind of answer the question a little bit, Julian?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, you know, all of you really have already touched on this idea of concern for what happens now that might be left in place afterward. And I think that that's definitely something that that we need to look out for. I just want to remind folks watching from home that you can send questions in. How do you do that? You let us know in the chat, and those will get fed to us, and I will make sure that folks get to hear them. So keep those questions about content moderation. Remember, there's another panel later. You can ask those questions then. So let's talk about a couple more things here. I want to talk a little bit about who we see is most affected by content moderation. And let's look at this broadly, because I know that, you know, we're only I've heard a 10th of the way into the pandemic. I don't know what the numbers are these days, but this is something that, as we've said, comes before and is going to go forward as well. So Corinne, could you start by just giving us kind of the big picture, some of the different communities that EFF has seen most affected by errors or by overly restrictive company policies?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, there have been examples are kind of legion. I actually testified before the U.S. Congress late last fall, and you submitted a seemingly endless number of examples to Congress to contemplate. And one of the things that we see a lot of times is that speech policies end up disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. So we've seen, platforms will mistake what we call counter speech for harassment. So if someone is trying to share with others the harassment that they are suffering so people know about it, a platform's policies may flag that as harassing speech itself. And so you can't even talk about how you're being harassed in your public forum. We've seen Twitter block speech around sexual health. We've seen and it gets even worse with automation. So Google had a new tool, an automated tool that identified a sentence like "I am a gay man" as highly toxic speech. Tumblr has a whole new anti-sexual content policy and has identified all kinds of things as sexual content when really it's just people trying to talk about something. And there have been many, many examples of takedowns that have affected the LGBTQ community in particular. And the thing that I want to flag about this is that even though right now we're in this moment of crisis, that moment of crisis doesn't put on hold all of these other issues. And in fact, it makes it more and more pressing. When we have to live our lives online in so many ways, it's actually more important than ever that people be able to contact and speak freely and speak to each other without a fear of being mistakenly or purposely taken down. I mean, I actually think it's more dangerous than ever. People are still needing to reach out and find community. LGBTQ youth are still needing to reach out and connect and get information just as much now and perhaps more than ever. And so when you have policies that are getting in the way of that, it's really actually dangerous.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much to the folks sending in the questions. First, I want to make sure that we get to those. I've also got a couple more questions for panelists. So I'm gonna, if it's okay with my panelists, I'm going to ask this first question from the audience now, and then we'll try to come back to the second one after some of the ones that we already talked about. So we've got this one. Many say that effective and appropriate content moderation at scale is impossible. I've got my opinion, but I want to know, do you folks on the panel have thoughts on this one?
I'm happy to speak to that. Because as some people may know, Jillian and I actually have written together about this and we have separately, but I think the answer is no. Well, or actually it's a little more nuanced than that. Sorry, I'm a lawyer. I think effective content moderation is possible at scale if you don't actually care about protecting speech at the same time. So I think you can set policies that will be, very broad and take down lots and lots of speech and take down most of what perhaps a government would like you to take down. But you're not going to be able to do that if you want to have a balanced policy that's actually making sure not to flag lawful speech, important speech, or even just silly speech that nonetheless, we should be allowed to engage in via our online platforms, especially now when we need to.
You guys have any thoughts you want to add?
I mean, speaking from work that I've been doing following content moderation that's going on regarding Iran, I feel like it feeds into what Corinne is saying is kind of the worst case scenario of over moderating, because when I see the application that platforms, for example, are putting into terrorist designations, I feel like it applies to that kind of over moderation where anything and everything related to a certain person who is part of a terrorist designation is now getting wiped off. And obviously, I think there's some political elements to that, given the politics and the geopolitical placement of platforms in America, and targeting those interests for foreign policy interests of the United States in particular. Obviously, it's more complex than that. So I just wanted to point out that worst case scenario is we often see it in certain specific situations.
Masa, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I know, I think the next question I was going to ask you may have brought us there anyway. So this is kind of a nice convergence. I wanted to ask you really about, because I know most of your research focuses on Iran. How are Iranians specifically impacted by corporate policies? And I know that, you've talked a lot about sanctions before. So I feel like that kind of goes into the question that or the response that you just gave.
I mean, very broadly speaking, overcompliance of tech companies, which by and large are American tech companies, which have to abide by American laws and therefore sanctions regulations, is really impacting, how platforms are received in Iran. I mean, you can go from the block of access to Apple's App Store for iPhone users in Iran to the blocking of anything that's being hosted on Google Cloud platforms for Iranians. But in terms of content moderation, we've increasingly been seeing this with, the removal of accounts related to the terrorist designation associated to the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. And so this was applied about April in 2018. And it wasn't much of a change because the Revolutionary Guards were always under some sort of terrorist list within the US, but this designation basically made penalties of interacting with them much more severe. And so after that rolled out, we saw platforms started removing a lot of accounts associated to the Revolutionary Guards. And this is really problematic because in Iran, it's a country with mandatory military service. And all the men who go through mandatory military service are basically put through 4 different organizations, and the Revolutionary Guards is one of them. So when you do this military service, you have 1 in 4 chance of being part of the Revolutionary Guards and therefore being designated as a terrorist, whether or not you chose that path or not. So in this way, it's quite problematic in how people kind of get wrapped into this. And of course, at the time, there was an overcompliance. A lot of accounts started getting removed. And I know Instagram, for example, came back and reapplied some of those accounts and explained it was a mistake. However, recently when we saw the assassination of the commander of the Revolutionary Guards, Qasem Soleimani, back in January, again, this problem resurfaced. And so anyone who was posting anything remotely to do with Qasem Soleimani was having their content removed, even if it was critical of the man, or if they happened to kind of frame it in a certain way. So if anyone was referring to Soleimani with the word martyr, for example, on Instagram, was getting their content removed. And if they reposted it, it would lead to suspensions. So that's kind of the broad sweep of policies that kind of end up discriminating against, I think, certain populations.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for putting that in detail. And I think we might throw a blog post link up there because I know that we've got one relates to that. I'm cognizant of the time, and I really want to make sure that I ask you my favorite question. So let's keep this one short if you can, and then I will try to get in 1 or 2 of these questions from the audience as well. So Jeff, I'm going to turn to you first. What is one thing that you think that companies need to be doing right now?
Okay.
I know.
Yeah, no, that's a big question. Well, I would say first, for any content that is removed, right? Because platforms are being used for human rights documentation, right? Whether it's the purpose or not, platforms are being used to host human rights documentation, right? If platforms remove this content, then we feel that it's important to have it stored, to have it accessible to researchers, to have it accessible to lawyers, to have it accessible to documentation groups, right? Whether or not that's public is a different question, right? But we feel that it's important to hold on to this and to just not remove it, right? Second, I would say that once some of these human reviewers are back and working again, right? Because this will happen at some point. It's definitely important to get them, psychosocial care, right? It's important to make sure that the reviewers are contextualized with the region, right? Knowing what's going on, and they're monitoring documentation based on regions that they're familiar with, right? Different contexts are different, right? So we can't apply the same thing to universally. We have to kind of, take different types of approaches in different places.
Absolutely. Masa, same question. What's one thing you think companies need to do?
So, I mean, some of the kind of rapid response I've been doing with lots of Iranians, what I've seen some of my colleagues do in Morocco, for example, has kind of lent to this idea that there should be a cross-platform cooperation in terms of how you reach out to certain communities that don't necessarily have the resources. Like everyone in this session right now, we probably know someone that's connected to these platforms that could help if, someone's life is being threatened and content needs to be removed, or if you need to find out why your account is being removed. We have those connections, but there's a lot of individuals and communities we deal with broadly that don't have these connections. And I think there should be mechanisms where these platforms kind of either come together and cooperate in a cross-platform way, but in a way that could also reach out to marginalized communities that have issues with access to account and their right to freedom of speech on these platforms.
Absolutely. Thank you, Masa. Corinne, I can give you that question, or you're also welcome to take this last one that we just got in from the audience, which is what we can learn from SESTA about, what we can learn from the experience of SESTA FOSTA about the consequences of content moderation.
Sure. So I'd be happy to answer that question. And the quick one, I'll answer your first one just very quickly. I think the one thing I would like to see companies doing right now is to publicly commit that the whatever they're putting in place right now in this moment of crisis is going to get rolled back and reviewed when it's over. So we're not permanently in this position. I think it's important to make that point. And then secondly, it's a very good question about SESTA FOSTA. That law is very problematic, and it basically made it extremely difficult for anybody to host information related to sex work, and even tangentially possibly related to it in some way, which meant that it was a law that swept up all kinds of material around sexual health, sexual education, made it hard for people to connect to each other to provide massage services, perfectly legitimate, lawful stuff all over the place, and really impeded the ability of sex workers to connect to each other, to educate each other, and to protect each other and form community. So that has been the unfortunate result of this law that was, I think, well-intentioned but badly drafted. And I can't resist saying that one of the things that EFF is doing is we've gone to court to have that law declared unconstitutional, and that case is ongoing.
Thank you. Do you folks have any last things that they want to get out there before we wrap up?
Maybe just from my side, what I would say is if community groups are having their accounts taken down, whether this is on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or whatnot, to please reach out to us, and we can try to do our best to get those pages back up.
Cool. Thank you for that. Well, so thank you so much, Masa Medarani. Why am I having a hard time pronouncing? I'm sorry. I know your last name. Article19.org, Jeff Deutsch from SyrianArchive.org, and Corinne McSherry from EFF.org. What we're going to do next is we're going to have a special musical guest from Berlin, but one moment before we do that, I just want to throw out there and mention, we talked about the Santa Clara principles a little bit during this. That's the principles on transparency and accountability and content moderation. And EFF and a number of other groups, including I think both of y'all, are part of a coalition that's working together to do an open consultation on that. So you can find more information there at santaclaraprinciples.org/CFP. I think I got that right. Whew. All right, thank you, Corinne, Masa, and Jeff. And we'll now turn it over to MC Engebot, live from Berlin.
Hello, thank you, Julian. Good evening, everybody. You all right? I'm MC Engebot. I'm going to play a couple of songs for you in between the panels. Here we go. You can hear me, yeah? One, two. fate, my fickle fate. Blessing and curse on a single plate. The top of the mountain's a lonely place. This is how I woke and fell asleep again. The rearview mirror's a clouded mirage. See through this visage. Let's talk it. Let's talk about it. I woke and fell asleep again. This is how. Yeah, and fell asleep again. Smoke on those leaves of grass, appearing some work of greater height, but it flatters me still. Anyway, it's about I woke and fell asleep again. I felt the strength of a million men. I've felt the depths of those other shame. It's a calculus trick. All the same, it's I woke and fell asleep again. Is this how I woke and fell asleep again? When you're making others feel at ease, tectonic plates of your life shift gears. The music changes. The question is then, did I wake or fall asleep again? The meaning empties out for me, and I'm back to the start. Yeah, to start again. In my beginning is my end. I fell asleep again. This is how I woke and fell asleep again. Is this how I woke and fell asleep again? Yeah. All good. Can you hear me? Yes. I see people writing things. Alrighty. Okay. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Behind every happy face and private bow. Behind every psycho circus lies the banal. Those looks and glances, they beget some drama. Simultaneously, as tragedy and as farce. analysis for politics. Yeah, but it's all a mess backstage. The river, there's nothing in its endlessness. Yeah, the river, there's nothing as it goes upon its way. But the workers, they know nothing of this drama. And the corner pubs, yeah, they've seen it, how they thought. They pull out of the bars and streets, and they mingle on the streets. Hear that chant go by with its wistful we have some little fun. Perspective means nothing when it's so real. The ludicrousness should provoke nothing but amusement. Magicians melancholy with the actors' ear. But the workers, they know nothing of this drama. In the corner pubs, yeah, they've seen it all before. They pour out of the bars and streets, and they mingle on the streets. Hear that tram go by with its whistle. Oh, yeah. We stay on stage since but in the clown car, you can't cheat death. This feeling should provoke amusement. We just laugh, clap, sing to its embrace. Yes, thank you. I'll do one more for you. We go back to our panel. Hello world, MC Angabo here. is its worst enemy, and it's a minister, writes its own history. In comfort, neutrality, or confusion, meditate on subjectivity. Where you stand, and how you feel. Every angle, both false and real. Not a victim, no victim, denying nor accepting liquidity. And how it all could be. So you can not take your time, right in the mercy. In this life, is there nothing really left to say? If our feelings, they can't be the same. And there's no way to pay. Treat time as a healer. Treat time as always available. Beaten or humbled by experience. Multicolored dress in black. Though careful, they split us through. Those realities inexorably linked to crazy stories, lies with thickness of a blood upon a page in the library of hearts. So we go, don't take our time, hard as a muscle in this life. Though there's nothing really left to say, if our feelings, they can't be the same. There's no way today. Is there nothing really left to say? If their feelings, they can't be the same. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to pay. There's nowhere to pay. There's no way to. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm MC Angabot. You can find me on the internet. And now we're going to go back to our panelists, Hayley, Sukayama. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Hi, thank you so much for that interlude. That was really fun. All right, well, thank you all for joining us. We're going to be starting our panel in just a second here. And today we're going to be talking about sort of the pandemic and privacy and apps that we're all using at home. And I think I'm going to welcome my panelists here. We have EFF staff technologist Bennett Cyphers. We have project manager Lindsay Oliver. And we have grassroots advocacy organizer Rory Meir. All right, thank you all for joining us today. It's nice to see your faces since, you know, normally we're in an office together and I've not really gotten to see you all that much. So, you know, I think we're going to go over a lot today. We're going to be talking about sort of tools that we're all using in the midst of this pandemic that, you know, we may not be as accustomed to using, and sort of tips and tricks for managing privacy there. We're going to be talking about worker privacy in relation to employees. We're going to be talking about student privacy in relation to schools and things that people can talk about. And yeah, just practical tips that people can be thinking about when it comes to their privacy as we sort of navigate this crisis. So get started. Yeah, I think, you know, as I said, we're all sort of adjusting to working online and using a lot of tools we may not be accustomed to using. Specifically, for example, we're using Zoom right now, and Zoom has been in the news a lot for privacy concerns. I think there's a lot of question over, you know, whether it's safe to use Zoom, how is it safe to use Zoom? So I'm going to turn it over to you, Rory, to kick us off to speak specifically about Zoom, which I know you've been looking at, and also tracking sort of the changes that Zoom has made. And so I'm kind of curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, this is an incredibly important situation. We're all stuck in our homes. Some of us lucky enough to be working from home. Others are still students. So we're relying on these telecommunication tools now more than ever. And I think Zoom in particular benefited from a big influx of new users, but at the same time, researchers and others focused and they were facing more scrutiny. So from that, we found a lot of privacy and security issues that people have been concerned about. And I think a unique phenomenon is how trolls have found those same exploits and have been abusing them for the phenomenon of Zoom bombing to disrupt Zoom meetings and posting abusive or offensive content and kind of disrupting usual business. So that prompted my colleague Jenny Gebhardt to start a blog post that I helped research with on how to fortify Zoom and make sure that you can protect yourself against these attacks. The blog article is Harden Your Zoom Settings to Protect Your Privacy and Avoid Trolls. And we found a lot of really interesting, simple tips from just little settings that you can change to make your meetings more secure. And luckily, Zoom has responded pretty positively to this feedback. Not only have they been saying a lot of planned new features, they've actually been acting on it pretty quickly. One such thing is they changed a lot of these default settings. For example, now by default, Zoom meetings have meeting passwords by default. And they added a new feature of a security button that when you're hosting a meeting, all of these settings aren't kind of buried in different menus for your individual account, for the individual meeting. You can find them all in one spot. So they've really improved the accessibility. And these are both really important because with defaults, a lot of folks, once they get something working, they don't want to mess with it and break it again. So having it be more secure by default is a great step. And then additionally, accessibility. A lot of folks aren't used to digging through all these options. So making it more accessible, another great first step. And while we really appreciate these first steps, they are just the first steps. We're hoping to see this trend continue for them to emphasize security, privacy, and openness on their platform. And we've seen in the last 2 weeks, these changes have been made. There's still Zoom bombing happening. There's still companies leaving Zoom for privacy concerns. So their work is by no means over. And I think it's worth noting that we are having our event on Zoom today, but that's not at all an endorsement from the EFF. It's really just contextual. This is a tool that is working for this event, and that's as far as we get into that. But that's why it's all the more important for folks to keep the pressure on Zoom. They are changing, and if they sense that the pressure isn't continuing, they might not continue in that direction. So keeping that on and evaluating alternatives. If you do have a choice in what platform you use, a lot of folks don't. Running through what is important to you and what sort of information are you trying to protect and which services are capable of viewing that. And ideally, all these services will compete with each other and we'll all have more privacy, security, and whatnot. So.
That's really great, and thank you for that. And Lindsay, I know Zoom is just one tool that we're using more and more right now. Are there things on like other specific apps that people might be using right now that they should be thinking about?
Absolutely. So one of the other platforms that people have made a large jump to is Slack. And Slack has been really useful for, keeping people connected, able to work, able to connect with their families and their friends, and also to do organizing. And one of the things that's important to know about Slack is that if you're using a free version of that platform, there are some data retention things that you should know about. Slack has the ability to retain the logs and of the communications in Slack. But that information is not necessarily available to the free Slack administrators who are, running the community that's on there. After 10,000 messages, you are not able to see prior messages. You are also not able to delete those messages. So if you are, using this platform to, stay connected, to do organizing, to maybe do your schoolwork, it's important to be aware of the ways in which data is being retained and, what you're able to delete or have access to. One of the other things that we've seen is that, there's a lot of healthcare that's happening online now. And telehealth has been able to connect people with their healthcare providers, but there are some potential risks involved. There was a relaxation of the rules for HIPAA, allowing healthcare providers to use tools and platforms that may not have been, that would have put them out of HIPAA compliance if they'd used it before. And one thing that's really important to note about tools and platforms and healthcare providers is that it is the healthcare provider that needs to be HIPAA compliant, not necessarily the tool or platform. So one of the things that people can do is, it's important to talk to your healthcare provider about, if we're doing this telehealth, what are the things in place to protect my privacy, to protect my data? And, if they're using something that does not allow them, does not keep them in HIPAA compliance, what are the plans to address those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we're all trying to figure out how to communicate and some of that information is so sensitive, it's like really important to be thinking about all those privacy concerns and sort of how you can protect yourself. So we sort of spoke generally about tools that we're using both, I think, at work and, in our personal lives. We're going to shift the conversation a little bit right now to talk about worker privacy in particular. I'm legislative activist here at EFF, and, when we're looking at sort of the legal landscape right now, the truth is that employers have a lot of power over their employees, especially when it comes to what workers do on devices that are owned by those companies. There are consumer privacy laws such as the California Consumer Protection Act, but those actually they specifically don't apply to workers, or in CCPA's case, employees are specifically carved out of those protections. There are a lot of people right now, including Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology, who are working on workers' privacy bills. In California, EFF is actually working with advocates in the labor community specifically on hammering out some of these issues. But this is an issue that's been kind of bubbling in the background of legislative landscape for a while, but is obviously an issue of concern even more so today because of what we're seeing some of these companies do. And actually to sketch out sort of what we're seeing, Bennett, I'm going to turn to you. And I know you've been looking at sort of electronic monitoring and sort of ways that companies are interacting with their workers right now.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, so there's this big trend right now towards companies that formerly mostly had people working in an office together, like shifting over to remote work. So everyone's working from home all the time. And there is this little cottage industry of software developers that create things for like tools. They're called like worker productivity monitoring tools, or more generally just like worker surveillance tools, where the employer can install some software on a worker's computer that collects information about like basically everything they do while they're at work, or all the time, depending on the tool, and then like digest that sorry, digest that into like reports that it gives to the manager or the boss or whoever. That's like, this worker spent this much time on these websites, and like, here are the people they emailed, and like, here's a list of screenshot, like here's a screenshot from every 30 seconds from their desktop the whole time that they were clocked in, and stuff like that. And so there's kind of like two general classes of this kind of software. The first is in cases where the employer owns the devices that people are using. So this is like, I think, an awful lot of companies these days, especially software companies. Like, I know I'm using an EFF computer right now. In those cases, bosses can install this software that basically acts like a Trojan. Like, it's completely silent. It runs in the background all the time. A lot of times they'll have like a lot of features that viruses have, where there'll be this like sketchy named process running in the background that's just like proc.exe or something. And if you go in and try and kill it, it'll start itself back up. And if you try and delete the files, like, you'll find that you don't have permission to delete the files, even though you're an administrator, and that kind of a thing. And they just like, they're invisible. There's no UI. Workers don't necessarily know they're there unless the bosses come out and tell them. And it just reports everything back to the boss. And some of these tools even have like remote access things where it's like, anyone with permissions can go in and just like take over the desktop at any time. They can turn on the webcam, they can turn on microphones, that kind of a thing. So yeah, if the company owns the computer, I'm not a legal expert, but it seems like a lot of these software providers that make this spy software will say like, yes, you are totally in the right to install this silently on all the computers that you distribute to employees, and like, you don't have to tell them about it. In other cases, like if you're working for your company from home on your own device, then your boss, like, I don't think they're allowed to, or at least they don't think they're allowed to just install stuff on your computer without your knowing. But they can instead say, hey, install this software that monitors you all the time and takes screenshots of your desktop, or you're fired, right? And so like, in those cases, the employee might know that they're being monitored, but they don't necessarily have the choice to opt out. So anyway, there's a bunch of companies that make this software, and they're seeing a big boom in business right now. And they're trying to really capitalize on COVID. Like, there's all these blog posts from these companies that are like, oh, here's how you can like transition over to a remote workforce with accountability. Like, here's how like spying on your workers like makes everyone happy, and that kind of a thing. So we're just kind of keeping an eye on that, trying to map out the landscape and maybe figure out what we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine that's a pretty fast evolving kind of situation. Are there things that workers should be, conscious of doing or not doing on devices? Are there things that we can be thinking about?
Yeah. So I think top line advice is like, if you're using your employer's device, like if it's a phone or a computer that's been issued to you by your employer, don't trust it. Like, use it for work stuff, but like, be really, really careful about the personal stuff on it. And like, even if your employer hasn't said that they're monitoring you, just know that they might be, and like, assume that they're like, and that goes down to things like passwords and like private emails, like that kind of a thing, could all be being collected and sent to your employer. If you're using a personal device, it's less likely that that's happening without you knowing about it. But you might be in a situation where your boss, your employer has pressured you into installing this kind of software. And unfortunately, I don't really know what you can do except to say like, hey, I'm not a fan of this. I don't really appreciate this. Here's why I don't think it actually makes me more productive. Or here's why I think you should consider like the rights of employees to have a private life outside of their professional life that you don't get to monitor. And here's other ways that we can talk about accountability and productivity.
All right, thank you. And thanks for keeping an eye on that, because I think that's definitely an area that we're going to hear a lot more about as this goes on. And sort of analogous to the worker debate and talking about privacy issues, I think we're also seeing a lot of remote learning, and we're seeing students face sort of similar versions of these issues. Lindsay, you've done a lot of work on student privacy. Can you just talk a little bit about when students are thinking about their privacy in terms of with their schools, what does that situation look like?
Absolutely. So the student privacy landscape contains a wide variety of software and technologies to be considerate about. So one of the things that has popped up in recent years are applications and software and just a variety of systems that are used to surveil students. And that is from the kindergarten level all the way through graduate school in some cases. And these technologies can cover a wide variety of surveillance techniques. There are school issued devices like Chromebooks that may have software installed on them that scans everything that students write into a Word doc, for example. There are technologies that monitor students' social media posts and send reports back to school administrators, or in some cases, their parents. There are, a variety of physical surveillance methods like audio. They're basically microphones that detect aggression that are placed within schools. And there's also, security cameras with, those are pretty self-explanatory. But as we've moved to online learning, those physical surveillance technologies are big, they're not really as useful right now. But we are seeing a major uptick in proctoring technologies. And what those are, just a brief primer, is they basically are software that take over your entire computer to make sure that you're not cheating on a test. And they are pretty, they dig in pretty deep, similar to how Bennett was describing the workplace surveillance that some workers may be under. The software has the ability to turn on your webcam, turn on your microphone. In some cases, there is a live proctor that is observing you through your web camera and watching you take the test. And there is also, in some cases, AI scanning that is being done on your facial expressions. And if you turn away from the computer for too long, you might get penalized by either a live proctor or, a piece of software, and have your test be invalidated. So the landscape has a wide variety of really just massively invasive surveillance software, and surveillance shouldn't be a prerequisite for an education. And there's some ways that people can fight back against that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've heard you speak about this a couple of times now, and I think one point that you make a lot that I really appreciate is, that we're seeing an increase in these use of technologies right now, but of course you don't necessarily want to, as you say, make it a prerequisite. You don't want to kind of normalize this idea that this is what school looks like.
Yeah.
So what can concern students or teachers or parents kind of do to push back on these technologies?
Awesome. Yes, there are some concrete steps you can take. Number one, it's really important to know what the technologies are that are being used in your schools. If you're a parent, if you're a student, if you're a teacher, and to understand what they are surveilling, what data they are gathering, and how long that data is being retained and who it is being shared with. So that's sort of the first step, is figuring out the lay of the land. And then the second step is really advocacy. And well, actually, I'm gonna back that up. Second step is protecting yourself. So if you are, working on a school issued device, and their, say, Gaggle is installed on your machine. That particular piece of software scans all of the content on the device it is installed on. It can integrate with a lot of content management and ed tech software like Office 365 or Google for Education, or Canvas, I believe is another one. So once you know what is being used to surveil you, you want to take steps to make sure that you can mitigate the amount of data that can be captured about you. So, you know, not logging into your social media on a school issued device if you are able, you know, figuring out what the potential risks are about, you know, whatever activity you need to do on your laptop or school issued device, and taking as much of your activities that you don't want surveilled off of that platform as possible. And then my third step is actually the advocacy. So we're stronger when we speak together. It's important to educate your peers and to tell adults that you trust, if you're a student, how this is affecting you. When you're being surveilled, who can you trust? Students who are being surveilled, like, they lose trust in their teachers, in their peers, in their districts, in their everybody, because when you are having someone watch you all the time, it really affects the, you know, your willingness to go ask for help when you need it. So communicating what those issues are to people who might not even know. The other thing you can do is, like, after you have told others what the issues are, once you have gathered support, go to your school districts, go to your school administrators, talk to your school IT person if you have one, and, you know, get their buy-in, present your issues, and, like, push back.
Yeah, so again, like, I think you're right. You know, as we head into the next school year, whatever that may look like, you know, hopefully there will be more opportunities for people to speak up about this and raise awareness in the meantime. I think that's great. We're getting a lot of great questions coming in. I just want to acknowledge that. We're going to have question and answer at the end, so but keep them coming. Okay, so we've talked about workers, we've talked about students. I think, you know, specifically looking at the pandemic and tech and, you know, how these things are interacting, you know, we're also hearing governments and tech companies talking about ways to use consumer applications to deal with this crisis by tapping into location data from our devices. Recently, Apple and Google announced that they're going to have a program to use phone information for contact tracing purposes to kind of figure out and track spread. You know, how should consumers be thinking about that? Bennett, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. It's one a lot of people have been asking, and I think we are.
Bennett, I think you're muted. Oh, there you go.
Got it. Great. Sorry. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think we're still kind of collectively figuring out the best way to do this. So yeah, so I'll talk about Apple and Google's thing specifically. I think in general, contact tracing, the purpose of all these contact tracing apps is to figure out, like, who's been near enough to someone who's infected that they might be at risk of contracting COVID. And this is the reason they're called contact tracing apps, is because traditionally there's this process of contact tracing that medical professionals do, where someone comes in and they test positive for some kind of disease, and then the medical professional just walks them through, like, all right, tell me everywhere you've been in the past 2 weeks, tell me everyone you've been in contact with, do you have contact information for them so that we can reach out to them? So that's kind of like the old school, like, pen and paper process. It's tried and true. It works well. Obviously, it has gaps for people who, like, you might come in contact with who are strangers. And you might put people at risk, but you don't know their contact information, so you can't warn them that they may be infected. So that's where contact tracing apps are supposed to come in. But there are a lot of issues with sort of the basic model of contact tracing apps that make them Well, it's a real open question how effective they're going to be. And I think that's the first thing to keep in mind is like there's a ton of issues from in order for these things to work, you need really widespread adoption. You need a lot of people to download these apps, and you need a lot of people to have smartphones. And like even in a country like America, we have far from universal smartphone adoption. There are real disparities in terms of age. The older people get, the less likely they are to have smartphones. Also, in terms of education, people with higher degrees of education are more likely to have smartphones as well. So like a lot of the people who are most vulnerable to the disease, particularly older people, are less likely to benefit from this kind of contact tracing. Beyond that, like a lot of older and cheaper phones just don't have the technology that's necessary to do this kind of high-tech contact tracing. So that's another kind of digital divide. And beyond that, like even if you have two people with brand new like Androids and they're right next to each other, and they both have this app downloaded, like there's all kinds of things that can go wrong in the like assessing of a contact. So like they use Bluetooth they use the strength of one phone will use the strength of the Bluetooth signal being emitted by another phone to try and determine how close the two phones are together. And then if it determines that they're close enough, it'll log a contact. But like that radio signal can be disrupted by all kinds of things. It's significantly disrupted by going through bodies of water, like the human body. But it is also not very disrupted by going through like a sheet of glass or a sheet of plastic, or your phone has no idea whether you're wearing a protective mask or not. So there are a lot of things that make it really difficult to like actually assess risk using these apps. And that's not to say they won't help. They might help. We just like really shouldn't count on them as a magic bullet. And so that's where you have to take that into the next phase of the assessment, which is like, are these apps going to be bad for privacy or bad for other civil liberties? And if so, is the trade-off worth it? So we've seen some proposals for apps that are absolutely bad for privacy. Like some people have talked about using raw location data from cell phone providers or from Google or whoever in order to do like contact tracing. Like, oh, if you were near someone else who had it, then like you should self-quarantine. But like, first of all, GPS data is even less accurate than Bluetooth, so it's just not good for that. And second of all, like that's a huge privacy risk. You don't want to have any kind of central authority who gets new access to this kind of location data that is more often than not collected consensually.
Okay.
Apple and sorry.
We're running short on time, and I want to be sure to get to questions. So, but folks can definitely, Bennett and a lot of people have been writing about this issue in particular, and I really encourage everybody to go to EFF.org/issues/COVID-19. You can see all of our posts that we've had there, and find out more about sort of what we're thinking about and what we're working on. So I do want to get to some questions, and I think people are really interested in sort of like practical tips and things that they can ways that they can use the information you've laid out for us. I think, Bennett, one question that we got is, how can I tell whether my employer is using one of these spying tools? I think you kind of mentioned they can be hard to find. Is there a way that we can figure that out?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're using one of the consensual ones, you'll probably know. If they're using one of the secret ones, it's really hard to tell. Like red flags to look out. So I don't think there's general advice. I'm sorry. It's like you kind of have to, if you're really comfortable like digging into the internals of a computer and like looking through all the processes that are running in the background and trying to figure out if there's anything suspicious, you can do that. Or you can like try and take it to a computer professional and be like, hey, do you see anything suspicious on this? But like there's a lot of different techniques that viruses and that this kind of software can use to stay hidden. So it's really tough.
Yeah. Okay. And I think, Lindsay, a question for you. You mentioned a couple of the tools that campuses and schools are using. Are there others? Like, what are some of the products that people can just to be aware of? Sort of, what some of these issues.
Unmuting would be helpful. So I've got a good list here of sort of the main ones. And if people could drop links to those in the chat, that'd be great. Securely, Gaggle, GoGuardian, Social Sentinel, And those are the sort of main four. There are a number of others, but these are the most common ones that we've seen. And I should note that Social Sentinel specifically, while it does a number of things that the other applications do, it specializes in social media monitoring of public posts.
Okay, awesome. And I also want to plug, Lindsay, there's a guide on the EFF website, is there not, for students?
There is. I'm surprised I forgot to mention it. So we did a lot of research into these surveillance technologies to spy on students, and we put together sort of a guide to what does this look like, what are the types of technologies that are being used, the types of data that can be collected, the surveillance techniques that are used. It also covers more in-depth advice on what students and parents and teachers can do, including a number of myth-busting tactics that you can take when folks try to argue, the benefits of surveillance. And then some recommended digital security practices and links out to other resources on the site that hosts the Student Privacy Guide, which is Surveillance Self-Defense. And it is a collection of sort of basic intros, in-depth how-tos, deep dives on larger concepts, and then playlists for specific audiences. So maybe you are a journalist and we've put together a list of things that might be specifically helpful for you. There's another list that's specifically for LGBTQ youth who may have trouble accessing resources they need online. And that site has just a number of resources that are incredibly helpful for educating yourself about surveillance and figuring out how you can best protect yourself and those you love.
All right. And Rory, just one quick one for you. If there is like one or two things that people kind of evaluating using these tools should be thinking about, what would those things be?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important if you are in the position where you get to choose what tool your group is using, be it at work or a study group or something, keeping in mind accessibility and education of your peers. Security and privacy is a team effort. So going through and making time to go through all the settings with people, make sure people understand what they're opting into when they're doing it. And as Lindsay mentioned, going through surveillance self-defense, it helps you make sense of what is the information we're trying to protect here and how important is it, so you don't have to go through extra hurdles than you need to in kind of putting together a security plan for your group. So getting in the habit of doing that is probably the number one advice.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you all for your time. Thank you to our audience for letting us go 5 minutes over so we could answer some of your questions. And I just want to remind everyone, if you want to support the work that we do here at EFF, you can donate at eff.org/EFF@home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Haley.
Thank you.
Thank you.